Times now. Action begins here.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. In this episode, we are going to look at Sino-Indian relations and the various aspects where India and China can move the relationship forward. Earlier this week, the special representatives of the government of India and China met in New Delhi to look at how to resolve the long-standing boundary dispute and how to continue to maintain peace on the LAC and the disputed boundary.
As India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval met up with the Chinese State Councillor Yang Jiechi, his counterpart, for the 18th round of boundary talks, apparently to find a resolution for the territories under occupation on the basis of the 2005 guiding principles to leave settled populations as they are. The focus of both sides has been to keep the LAC peaceful. Encroachment by Chinese troops in Ladakh last year became an embarrassment for the Chinese president on his much-publicized visit to India. China eventually withdrew its troops, but the disagreements on the boundary remain. India's position is that its northern borders stretch from northwest tip of Jammu and Kashmir, the tri-junction of India, Afghanistan and China, to the northeast of Arunachal Pradesh or tri-junction of India, China, Myanmar. Total of 3,488 kilometers. The Chinese claim is that the Indian boundary starts from west of Karakoram Pass, with India in adverse possession of 500 square kilometers land in Demchok in eastern Ladakh, which their troops encroached upon last year. And Beijing also lays claim to Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh, which it regards as part of southern Tibet. Only the central sector of the boundary west of Nepal is uncontested by China, for which it has agreed to exchange maps. But with China seeking major land concessions in both the western and eastern sectors, as Beijing claims 70,000 square kilometers of land in Arunachal Pradesh, New Delhi believes that the Chinese army is still in occupation of 94 square kilometers of land near Sikkim in Namkachu, Samdrongchu and Longchu, the battlefields of the 1962 war. China's strategy towards all its boundary disputes is based on making big territorial claims to put its rivals on the defensive. However, optimists feel that both sides could move forward by focusing more on trade and investments, with the aim of moving Sino-India bilateral trade to the $100 billion figure soon. But that can only happen if Beijing softens its stand on the age-old boundary dispute. Clearly, there is a lot of ground to cover before Prime Minister Narendra Modi undertakes his first visit to China next month.
Clearly, the boundary dispute between the two countries is going to take a long time before both countries come around to a settlement, because 18 rounds of talks haven't got us too far as yet. But what could really turn the tide in Sino-Indian relations is the hope for much bigger economic cooperation between the two countries, and Mr. Modi's forthcoming visit to China could have some surprise for those who have written off the relationship between the two countries as purely border-related rivalry. We have with us two guests today. We have Professor Shrikant Kondapalli from Jawaharlal Nehru University, who is the key person in their JNU's China program and a long-standing observer of China, and General Dipankar Banerjee, once again a strategic affairs expert who has been looking at China and has been involved on various issues, including visits to China about Sino-Indian relations, currently the head of the Forum for Strategic Initiatives and also the founding director of the IPCS. Professor Kondapalli, my first question to you. Why is there such a departure between Beijing's view and Delhi's view based on the historical baggage we both have inherited on the boundary dispute?
I think there is this incompatibility between the Chinese view and the Indian view on the territorial dispute. China's position is very inconsistent when it came to what they call as unequal treaties. They said McMahon Line is an unequal treaty, but the 1895 Sino-Vietnamese Convention which was drawn between the Qing dynasty and the French Empire, that was not treated as an unequal treaty. In other words, this is the incompatible view between the two sides. From the Chinese point of view, there has been a disjuncture in their views regarding the territorial dispute.
General Banerjee, this is clearly the point where I think the relationship is stuck. You've been one of the earlier movers in this whole initiative of boundary talks. Where is there a point where we can both meet? We know where the departure points are, but where is the meeting point? Is there a possible meeting point between the two countries?
On the question of the borders in the eastern sector, which is along the Himalayas, the watershed on the high Himalayas are a very defining area for separating the two countries' influences. The Tibetan Plateau in the north and India in the south. And the high ridge on the Himalayas actually define the territorial jurisdiction of either side. Of course, in different times in history, this have either been delineated, agreed upon, or perhaps left to the vagaries of nature in the past. Historically, boundaries were never clearly delineated on the ground, always seldom delineated on the ground. It is a post-Westphalian situation when nation states became to be established in the natural system, and then the boundaries became important.
I just want to come in once again, Professor Kandapalli, that China claims about 7,000 square kilometers of territory in India's east, Arunachal particularly, and their real sore point is Tawang, and they claim it's part of southern Tibet. What is really China's position now? Because I understand from 2003, 2005 onwards, it was agreed that neither side will claim areas where there is settled population. Why has China changed its position?
I think from 2003 to roughly 5, as you mentioned, there has been an emphasis on Arunachal Pradesh in the Chinese view. And they started calling this in the official documents and in the official pronouncements as Southern Tibet. And this is partly because they say that in the 15th century, the 6th Dalai Lama came from the Tawang monastery. And so the argument basically is that since Tibet belonged to China, so Tawang should belong to Tibet and then to China. So that's a very specious argument to say that, in history, someone belonged to some territory, and so the territory belongs to the current day.
Well, by the same yardstick, if they're quoting history, then there is the 1914 Shimla Agreement, which they don't tend to agree to. So when it suits them to talk about history, and when it suits them, they tend to ignore history. General Banerjee, sir, the other part of the boundary which is disputed essentially in Ladakh, and we saw intrusions last year, there was a lot of concern in India. China tried to play it down. It was an embarrassment for China's president when he was visiting India. There is the military dimension, and China has been, though the Ministry of External Affairs says that we have a peaceful relationship, China does do a certain amount of muscle flexing. What is our ability to respond in the event of a Chinese aggression once again?
Well, actually, as you quite clearly demarcated, both in the east and in the west in Ladakh, there are different perceptions. Whereas in the east, the boundary, as I said, along the high Himalayas should be clearly delineated and generally accepted. But there again, I must say that China has been changing its position on these border alignments and acceptance of this. The 2003-2006, really a 2006 phenomena of calling the Northeast Frontier Division or Arunachal Pradesh as Southern Tibet is both mischievous and wrongly asserting its claim over the entire province. It is patently unsustainable through any legal or other earlier treaty obligations. In Ladakh, there are possibilities of 3 clear lines along which borders could have been divided. Now, in a short program like this, and without a clear understanding of the terrain features, I do not want to go into the details of these 3 separate lines. But there at least, there could be some discussion as to along which alignment the international boundary between India and China will exist. And there's scope for discussions there. Of course, the fact that China has currently occupied much of that territory after 1962 and continues to hold that is in itself a demonstration of its aggressive intent in Ladakh.
Professor Kondapalli, two issues, and I want quick answers. One is that China has a tradition of nibbling away at territory of its neighbors and keep making larger than life claims so that when you finally have a negotiated settlement, China comes out an advantage. And the other is that what is really the way forward in dealing with the Chinese?
You're right that there has been an expansion in the Chinese posture in both Ladakh as well as in the Arunachal Pradesh sector. But we have also seen in the central sector and in Sikkim area, which is not disputed between the two sides, we have seen some nibbling, especially in the finger point in northeast Sikkim region. So there has been an expansion in the Chinese patrolling as well as nibbling away of the territories in the closer to the McMahon line areas as well as in other sectors of the border. In terms of the second issue on what is the way forward, I think India needs to emphasize more on conventional and strategic deterrence to protect its interests on the border areas. I think it needs to enhance the strike corps deployments as well as performance of the other 4 corps which have been located in these areas. This is one measure that India can do in the immediate future. Secondly, India also needs to participate extensively in the confidence building measures between the two armed forces. Both in the army to army as well as in the Air Force section, we need to stabilize those areas for common stability in the border areas.
So clearly we've discussed the military and the boundary issues, but we'll be back after a break and look at what other measures Delhi and Beijing can adopt to move the relationship forward, particularly in the areas of trade and other bilateral diplomatic initiatives.
Times now. Action begins here.
Welcome back. General Banerjee, Professor Kondapalli was talking about the military measures that can be adopted to convey a message to China that we are talking from a position of strength now. India is not the India of 1962. Do you think we have the military capabilities to take on the huge Chinese buildup that has been taking place on the Tibetan plateau?
Well, of course, at one stage, the reality today is that China has spent an enormous amount of money in preparing and building up its defenses. The PLA today also is no longer what it was in the early years, late 50s and early 60s, and they've changed dramatically. But the Indian Army is fundamentally different. It was an army then which never contemplated the use of force, and just its own presence was enough, so-called, to deter the Chinese, which of course proved a disaster in our strategic thinking. Today, the whole situation is dramatically different. Both India and China are nuclear weapon powers. A conflict, a war between nuclear weapon powers is not to be contemplated, and neither is it likely. Conventionally, our forces are immeasurably stronger, and hence the type of teach a lesson war that Mao inflicted on India in 1962 would instead lead to a teach a lesson a la Vietnam of 1979 on the Chinese. And so there are these dramatic differences that exist today.
Professor Kondapalli, you have been reading the Chinese mind and their behavior for years now. What do you make of the Chinese relationship with Pakistan? It has been argued that China continues to prop up Pakistan to ensure that India continues to remain bogged down in South Asia and doesn't play a bigger role both in Asia and in world affairs. Do you buy that?
Indeed. I think one of the reasons why we have not been able to really actively pursue the territorial dispute resolution is also the Pakistan factor. That China does not want to resolve the territorial dispute because that would have stretched out the Indian armed forces, both on the Pakistani front as well as on the Chinese front. So this is one connection that they have in relation to Pakistan. The Pakistan connection also becomes quite obvious because in 1963, soon after the 1962 war, Pakistan transferred 5,200 square kilometers of Sakshgam Valley to China in lieu of a few pockets in north of Siachen Glacier. So this indicates actually Pakistan is also a party to this kind of dispute in which China sees this as a kind of a balancer for India. Thirdly, in terms of the positions that China has in Ladakh, in Aksai Chin, in Tibet, Western Tibet and south of Xinjiang, there has been huge Chinese development programs here, both in the infrastructure, dual-use infrastructure, for both the civilian as well as for the military purposes. So in other words, China is activating that front in the recent period.
General, China came up with an interesting suggestion, intriguing, I would say, recently when the Chinese ambassador suggested that India and Pakistan could become part of China's Silk Road initiative of trade in this part of the world, and how the two Punjabs in India and Pakistan could be brought under the umbrella of a Chinese trade initiative. And likewise, many other initiatives that China has in mind for Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, etc. Do you think India is going to go along with the Chinese angle?
This is a new geostrategic plan of China in extending its influence, first in Asia and then globally, Central Asia and beyond. And so therefore, we see these two distinct concepts of Silk Road, the maritime Silk Road, attempting to link through Myanmar and, of course, northeastern India to the Bay of Bengal elsewhere, and going on to the west, and also the land Silk Route, the whole circle going from through Kazakhstan and beyond, including Central Asian Republic on the other side. And so there are several such strands that emerge from these two central routes. Of course, the specific route that you mentioned through the central heartland, linking up with Turkmenistan, gas and energy resources from there, was actually Hillary Clinton's idea. So this was a Silk Route that Hillary Clinton had sponsored. These Silk Routes are the trading routes of today, of the 21st century. These will become more relevant, and everybody will have to increasingly participate in these. But the objectives of such Silk Routes, the planning for these, the coordination of these, the structure of these require much more careful, deliberate planning. While India is ready and willing to cooperate in developing routes of trade, transit, and cooperation, we also have to take care of our own strategic interests.
Yes. Professor Kandapalli, quickly in the end, just want to know, what do you expect from Mr. Modi's visit to Beijing? To what extent there is hope there, or it's just starting a new relation? There are two strong leaders in both countries.
Indeed. I think Prime Minister Modi's visit, the major expectations are that there will be manufacturing centers established in India in lieu of China learning from India on the service sector, number one. Number two, in terms of expanding the trade component with China importing more goods, especially in the pharmaceutical sector as well as in the software, IT software sector. Please remember that the last year's trade deficit was more than $35 billion. In other words, India lost about $35 billion to China in the last year. So this is a huge component in terms of Indian current account deficit. So I think India will nudge China to open up its market under the WTO procedures. So I think there is a lot of scope in these economic activities.
Right. Thank you very much. I think we've got a lot of points. And in sum, I think what we've come out with in this discussion is the first, that China tends to fudge facts based on history to suit its own argument. Militarily, India is different from the India of '62 and is quite capable of giving China a strong rebuff if it decides to intrude into Indian territory. China-Pakistan relations, quite clearly, are something that Beijing is pushing to continue to keep India unsettled. And the Silk routes are going to be more and more relevant in the future as trading arrangements. And finally, Mr. Modi's got his task worked out. He has to try and get China to come around to overcoming the trade deficit which is in China's favor vis-a-vis India. Thank you very much for being with us on this show. We'll be back next week with another episode of Latitude. Until then, goodbye.